Her mother gave birth to Sylvia at a late age. The girl did not remember her father because he left when she was only 1 year old. A few years later, her mother married a second time. The stepfather often drank and was abusive. Sylvia was terribly afraid of his drunken debauches and tried to leave the house when he was like that. Her mother usually came home late, and Sylvia had to wait for her at the staircase or on the playground in front of the block. Sylvia did not study very well. She did her homework as if it was not important. Mother periodically forced her to do various household chores, which Sylvia also did without any particular zeal. Of course, they did not live in extreme poverty, but with a perpetual sense of lack of money and a total economy. One day, Sylvia's mother was hospitalized, and in the evening, Sylvia had to go home alone. She went back later than usual and quietly, like a mouse, slipped into her room, and there she was grabbed by her drunken stepfather and thrown on the bed. A struggle ensued, and Sylvia managed to push him off and run out into the corridor. She threw open the door and rushed out of the apartment as she was, and hid not far away in the bushes. Her stepfather did not run after her. It was early autumn outside, and soon Sylvia began getting cold. She was sheltered by a neighbour, an odd-looking elderly woman. Many times Sylvia saw Mrs. Hackett feeding cats and pigeons. The boys made fun of her and teased her a little, but the old lady never took offence, not noticing the silly children's jokes. Mrs. Hackett's house was, to Sylvia's amazement, clean and tidy. There were no cats or other animals. The woman fed Sylvia with delicious porridge, made her tea and put her to bed. From fatigue and stress, the girl fell asleep instantly. So, Sylvia and Mrs. Hackett became friends. The elderly woman fed the girl, took her to school, helped her with her lessons every day. At the same time, she was quite reticent. She listened more, smiled, and took Sylvia outside to feed the cats and pigeons. The girl suddenly realized that she was almost happy at this time. There was no more of her stepfather's binges, no waiting in the stairwell. Her anxiety vanished, and Sylvia suddenly took up her studies. She timidly began to smile and notice pleasantries. Only her mother's illness disturbed her. So 3 weeks passed, and then her mother came home from the hospital. During all this time, Sylvia visited her only every few days. Her mother turned out to have an untreatable disease. She had an operation, but it didn't help. Mum lost weight and didn't look like herself. Sylvia felt sorry for her and cried. It was hard for Sylvia to take care of her mother, and the woman asked her to call her own sister to come and help. For some reason, their relationship was not good, and they rarely communicated. Aunt Irene began to visit and care for Sylvia's mother. She shamed the stepfather, but he had been degrading for a long time, and now he had completely gone bad. He became so disruptive that he hit Aunt Irene. She reported him to the police, and he got a month in jail. While my stepfather was in prison, Sylvia's mother died. The girl and her aunt searched the house and, to everyone's dismay, found the documents for the apartment. Somehow, mysteriously, the apartment now belonged to the stepfather. So, Sylvia moved in with Aunt Irene. Living with her was not sugar, and now the girl could understand why her aunt and mother did not get along. Aunt Irene was bossy and impatient. She demanded unconditional obedience. Any fault, a bad grade, or a slanted look was followed by a heap of admonitions. But Sylvia had no relatives except her aunt after her mother's death, so there were no place to go away. One day, walking past the building where she spent her childhood, Sylvia saw Mrs. Hackett feeding her cats. The girl happily ran up to her and began to help. Then Mrs. Hackett invited her to tea, and Sylvia told her how unhappy her life was at her aunt's, and cried at the end. Then Mrs. Hackett offered to spend the night at her place. Aunt Irene surprisingly agreed to it. Most likely Sylvia was already a bit of a burden to her. At night the girl had a dream where she was crying and her mother was caressing her head. She awoke from her tears and from the warm touch of someone's hands. It was Mrs. Hackett. She calmed Sylvia, brought water, and the girl went back to sleep. So Sylvia began to come to Mrs. Hackett more often, and the more often she spent the night at her place, the happier she became. After graduating from high school, Sylvia became a distance learner in college. She worked during the day and studied in the evenings. Sylvia didn't live at her aunt's anymore. She moved in with Mrs. Hackett for good. One day she met her stepfather. Fortunately, he didn't recognize her. He was sitting drunk on a bench, wearing a dirty jacket from someone else's shoulder. There was some of her mother's things and pictures left in his apartment, and suddenly Sylvia decided to take them while he was in alcoholic prostration. Besides, she still had the key to the apartment. Out of habit, she quietly opened the door and found herself in the apartment where she had spent her childhood. The stench almost knocked her down, and she went straight to her room. There on the bed was a woman asleep. Not to wake her up, Sylvia went into the living room. Dirt and ruin were everywhere. In the living room, she rummaged through the cupboard for a long time and found a package with some family pictures in it. There was nothing left of her mother's things. Upset, Sylvia came out of the room and bumped into a woman who walked past her, unconscious of anything, into the bathroom. The girl, overcoming squeamishness, walked to her room. She had her own little hiding place in the wall, where she had kept her secrets as a child. With difficulty, pushing the bed aside, she found a hole in the wall behind the wallpaper and pulled out a bundle of stuff from there. Hearing the woman was returning, Sylvia quickly slipped out of the apartment. Once at Mrs. Hackett's house, Sylvia began to look at the pictures. Memories came flooding back, and tears came with them. Having calmed down a little, the girl decided to unwrap the secrets of her childhood. And instead of them, she saw stacks of money. Puzzlement as to where the drunkard got so much money did not leave Sylvia for a long time. A month later, she learned that recently there was a fire in her stepfather's apartment. The owner died, and the apartment was completely burned out. The neighbours were not hurt. In fact, Sylvia at first did not know what to do with such a sum that had fallen on her head. Then she had a dream to open her own business and buy a small, comfortable house on the sea for her and Mrs. Hackett, the dearest person to her.